Marco had been saving every crust for 3 days, but when he peeled back the thin cloth covering their last piece of bread that morning, green mold bloomed across its surface like tiny forests of despair. The 8-year-old stared at the ruined loaf, his stomach hollow and aching, knowing that his grandmother Nonna hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days. The cramped apartment held the stale scent of sickness and poverty. Sunlight struggled through the single grimy window, casting weak shadows across the worn wooden floor, where Marco knelt beside their makeshift food storage, a chipped ceramic bowl that now held only disappointment. He could hear Nonna's labored breathing from the narrow bed they shared, each exhale a reminder of how fragile she'd become since the fever took hold. Marco's small fingers traced the edges of the mouldy bread as if willing it to transform back into something edible. 3 days ago, Signora Benedetta from downstairs had given them this loaf out of pity, and he'd been so careful to make it last. A piece for breakfast, a piece for dinner, saving the middle portion for when things got desperate. Now, things were beyond desperate, and even their last hope had betrayed them. He glanced toward the bed where Nonna lay beneath their threadbare blanket, her grey hair spread across the flat pillow like silver threads. Her cheekbones had grown sharp over the past week, and her hands, once strong enough to knead pasta dough and mend his torn clothes, now trembled when she tried to lift them. "Marco." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Is it morning already?" He quickly wrapped the mouldy bread back in its cloth, not wanting her to see their situation had grown even worse. "Yes, Nonna, the sun is up." He forced brightness into his voice, though his heart felt heavy as a stone. "How are you feeling?" She attempted to sit up but fell back against the pillow with a soft sigh. "Better," she lied, and they both knew it. Did you eat something?" Marco looked at the covered bread, then at his grandmother's trusting face. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. Standing up with quiet determination, he moved toward the door, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. "I'm going to get us breakfast, Nonna. Real breakfast. Just rest." The marketplace was only 6 blocks away, and Marco had noticed how busy it got during the morning rush. Marco's bare feet moved silently across the cobblestones as he left their building, but each step felt heavier than the last. The morning air carried the scent of baking bread from somewhere in the distance, making his empty stomach clench with longing. He'd never taken anything that didn't belong to him. Nonna had raised him to be honest, to work for what he needed, to ask for help before resorting to desperation. But asking hadn't worked. He'd knocked on 3 doors yesterday, and each neighbor had looked at him with the same apologetic expression, their own pantries nearly as bare as his. The Rossi family had shared their last can of tomatoes 2 weeks ago. Signora Benedetta had already given them the bread that now lay rotting in their bowl. Even Father Giuseppe at the parish had explained, with genuine sorrow in his eyes, that the church's food supplies were depleted until the next donation drive. As Marco walked through the narrow streets of their neighborhood, he saw the familiar. Signs of struggle everywhere. Laundry hung limply from windows, too few clothes stretched thin to dry. Old men sat on stoops with hollow cheeks and empty hands. A woman across the street bounced a crying baby, her own face gaunt with exhaustion. This wasn't just their problem. Hunger had settled over their corner of the city like a persistent fog. The weight of what he was considering pressed against his chest like a physical thing. Stealing. The word felt foreign and bitter in his mind. Nonna had told him stories of saints who would rather starve than take what wasn't theirs, of martyrs who chose suffering over sin. But those saints hadn't watched their grandmothers waste away, hadn't listened to labored breathing in the dark hours before dawn. Marco paused at the corner where their street met the main road leading to the marketplace, his reflection caught in a shop window. A thin boy with dark circles under his eyes, wearing clothes that had grown too large as he'd grown too small. He looked like a ghost of himself. Maybe just this once, he thought, his small hands clenching into fists. Maybe God would understand that sometimes love required impossible choices. Maybe taking one small loaf, just enough to give Nonna strength, wouldn't damn his soul forever. The marketplace sounds grew louder ahead, vendors calling their wares, coins changing hands, the bustle of commerce that had continued while his world slowly collapsed. Marco took a deep breath and stepped onto the main road, knowing he was crossing more than just a street. The marketplace exploded with life around Marco, like a symphony of abundance he could only observe from the outside. Vendors' voices rose above the crowd in melodic calls: fresh tomatoes, olive oil from Tuscany, fish caught this morning, while coins clinked in weathered hands and paper bags rustled with purchases. The cobblestones beneath his feet were worn smooth by decades of commerce, and everywhere he looked, people moved with the confident purpose of those who had money to spend. But it was Giuseppe's bread stall that drew Marco like a moth to flame. Golden loaves were arranged in neat rows on wooden shelves, their crusts gleaming in the morning sun. The scent of yeast and flour filled the air so thickly Marco could almost taste it. Focaccia dotted with herbs, round country loaves with crackling crusts, small rolls that would fit perfectly in a boy's hungry hands, all just an arm's length away, yet impossibly distant. Giuseppe himself was a mountain of a man with flour-dusted apron and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled at his customers. Marco watched him hand a warm loaf to an elegantly dressed woman, accepting her coins with a gracious nod. "Grazie, Signora Martinelli. Give my regards to your husband." The woman tucked the bread into her basket alongside other treasures: imported cheese, fresh fruit, delicate pastries. Marco's stomach twisted as he imagined what even one of those small rolls would mean to Nonna, how it would bring color back to her cheeks, strength to her trembling hands. "And what can I get for you, young man?" Giuseppe's voice startled Marco. From his reverie, the baker had noticed him standing there, studying the display with intense longing. Marco's hand instinctively moved toward his pocket, then stopped. There was nothing there. No coins, no crumpled bills, not even lint. His throat constricted as the reality crashed over him anew. All around him, life continued its normal rhythm. A mother counted out change for her children's lunch bread. An old man selected a loaf with the casual certainty of someone who'd never wondered where his next meal would come from. I was just looking," Marco managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Giuseppe's expression softened slightly, but he was already turning toward another customer, a woman with a crying baby who needed his attention. The moment passed, and Marco stepped back into the crowd, invisible once more. He circled the stall slowly, watching the steady flow of transactions, memorizing Giuseppe's movements, calculating the rhythm of business. His heart hammered against his ribs as an impossible plan began to form. Marco positioned himself behind a vegetable cart across the narrow aisle, pretending to examine withered carrots, while his eyes never left Giuseppe's bread stall. From this vantage point, he could observe the baker's entire routine without drawing attention, just another poor child lingering where he didn't belong. Giuseppe moved with practiced efficiency, but Marco noticed patterns in his movements. Every few minutes, the baker would turn away from the display to retrieve fresh loaves from wooden crates behind his counter. During those brief moments, no more than 10 or 15 seconds, his back would be completely turned. The small rolls sat on the front edge of the display, within easy reach of someone quick and desperate enough. The moral weight of what he was planning pressed against Marco's chest like a stone. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "We may be poor, Marco, but we are not thieves. Our dignity is all we truly own." She'd said those words just last month, when he'd found coins someone had dropped and brought them home. She'd made him return everyone, despite their empty cupboards. But that was before the fever took hold, before her breathing became labored and her hands too weak to hold a cup of water. Before their last piece of bread grew mold while she lay dying, Marco watched a well-dressed family approach Giuseppe's stall. The father wore a pressed suit, the mother carried a leather purse, and their 2 children chattered excitedly about which pastries they wanted. The baker smiled warmly, engaging them in conversation about special orders for Sunday dinner. This was it. Giuseppe would be distracted for several minutes. The boy's legs felt unsteady as he edged closer, using the crowd as cover. A small round roll, golden brown and still warm from the oven, sat at the very edge of the display. It would fit in his palm, disappear under his shirt in an instant. Giuseppe's back remained turned as he showed the family his selection of specialty breads. Marco's hand trembled as he reached forward, then pulled back. The saints Nonna had told him about seemed to watch from the shadows, their disappointed faces haunting his peripheral vision. But stronger than their judgment was the memory of her hollow cheeks, the way she tried to hide her weakness behind false smiles. 3 steps forward, stretch his arm, grab the roll, turn and disappear into the crowd. The family was still talking, Giuseppe still engaged. Marco took the first step, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain everyone in the marketplace could hear it. 2 more steps to go. Marco's fingers hovered inches from the golden roll, his entire body frozen between desperation and conscience. The lunch crowd had swelled around Giuseppe's stall, creating a perfect storm of distraction. Mothers, haggling over prices, workers grabbing quick meals, children tugging at parents' sleeves. The baker's attention was completely absorbed by a demanding customer who insisted on examining every loaf before making her selection. The warm roll sat there, so close Marco could smell the yeast and flour, could imagine how it would taste on his tongue, how it might bring life back to Nonna's eyes. His hand trembled in the space between innocence and theft, suspended like a prayer, waiting for an answer. Time seemed to stretch impossibly thin. The marketplace sounds, the chatter of vendors, the clink of coins, the rustle of paper, faded to a distant hum. All that existed was Marco's reaching hand and the bread that could save his grandmother's life. Just one small movement forward, a quick grab, and he could disappear into the crowd before anyone noticed. But as his fingers drew closer, Nonna's face appeared in his mind with startling clarity. Not the pale, weakened version lying in their bed, but the Nonna who had raised him, strong, proud, teaching him right from wrong with gentle hands and unwavering faith. She was watching him, he realized. Even now, even here, she was watching. We are not thieves, Marco. Our dignity is all we truly own. The words hit him like a physical blow. His hand jerked back as if the bread had burned him, and he stumbled backward into the crowd. A woman with a shopping basket bumped into him, muttering an irritated apology, but Marco barely heard her. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Giuseppe completed his transaction and turned back toward his display, his eyes briefly scanning the area where Marco had been standing. For a terrifying moment, their gazes met across the stall. The baker's expression showed mild curiosity. Perhaps he'd sensed someone watching, but no suspicion. Marco was just another hungry child in a marketplace full of abundance he couldn't afford. The boy backed away further, his legs unsteady, his heart still racing from how close he'd come to crossing a line he could never uncross. But the hunger remained, gnawing at his insides like a living thing. And somewhere across the city, Nonna was growing weaker with each passing hour. Marco pressed his back against a stone wall, watching Giuseppe's stall from a safer distance, knowing he would have to try again. 20 minutes passed before Marco found the courage to approach the stall again. Giuseppe had just finished serving a line of customers when a delivery truck arrived, requiring him to step away, and help unload fresh supplies. This was it, a longer distraction, a real opportunity. Marco's stomach cramped with hunger so intense, it felt like claws raking his insides. He moved through the thinning crowd with forced casualness, his eyes fixed on the same golden roll that had tempted him before. His grandmother's face flickered in his mind, but this time he pushed the image away. Nonna needed food more than she needed his perfect innocence. Marco reached the stall's edge and extended his trembling hand toward the bread. His fingers were barely an inch away when a large, flour-dusted hand clamped down on his wrist like a vice. "What do you think you're doing, boy?" Giuseppe's voice boomed across the marketplace, and Marco's world collapsed into a single moment of pure terror. The baker had returned without warning, moving with surprising stealth for such a large man. His grip was firm but not painful, yet Marco felt as if he were being crushed by the weight of his shame. I wasn't." Marco's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "You weren't what? Taking my bread?" Giuseppe's tone carried disappointment rather than anger, which somehow made everything worse. "I've been watching you circle my stall for an hour, boy. Did you think I was blind?" A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Marco felt their eyes on him like burning coals, shoppers pausing with their full baskets, other vendors craning their necks to see what was happening. A woman whispered to her companion, "Catching them young these days." A man shook his head in disgust. No respect anymore. Marco's face burned with humiliation as tears threatened to spill from his eyes. This was worse than hunger, worse than watching Nonna fade away, this public exposure of his desperate attempt at theft. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the cobblestones, and never face another human being again. "Please," he managed to whisper, though he wasn't sure what he was asking for. Release? Forgiveness? Understanding? Giuseppe's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. His eyes studied Marco's thin frame, the worn clothes hanging loose on his small body, the dark circles of exhaustion beneath frightened eyes. "What's your name, boy?" Giuseppe asked, his voice softer now, but still carrying the authority that had drawn every ear within 20 feet. "Marco," he breathed, wishing he could take back even that small piece of himself. "Marco," Giuseppe repeated. And something in the way he said the name, gentle, patient, broke the dam that had been holding back the boy's tears. They came in a rush, hot and unstoppable, streaming down his cheeks as his small body began to shake. "I'm sorry," Marco sobbed, the words tumbling out between gasps. "I'm so sorry. I never took anything before. I promised Nonna. I would never—" His voice cracked, and he wiped his nose with his free hand, leaving a streak across his dirty sleeve. Giuseppe's grip loosened further, though he didn't release the boy entirely. The crowd pressed closer, some faces showing irritation at the disruption, others beginning to soften as they witnessed the child's genuine anguish. "Who is Nonna?" Giuseppe asked quietly. "My grandmother." Marco's voice was barely audible now, each word a struggle. She's really sick. She has this fever and she can't eat and she's getting so thin and weak and I don't know what to do." The confession poured out of him like water from a broken pipe. "Our bread got moldy this morning and it was the last food we had, and she hasn't eaten anything real in 2 days, and I thought maybe just one small piece." His words dissolved into sobs that shook his entire frame, the weight of 3 sleepless nights, of watching his grandmother fade, of his own gnawing hunger, crashed over him all at once. He felt smaller than he'd ever felt in his life, standing there in front of all these strangers, with his shame and desperation laid bare. "Where are your parents, child?" an elderly woman in the crowd asked, her voice touched with concern. Marco shook his head, unable to speak. Giuseppe answered for him in a low voice. "Look at him. Does he look like he has parents to care for him?" The crowd's murmur shifted, judgment giving way to something softer, A young mother clutched her own child closer, imagining what desperation could drive a boy to steal. A businessman loosened his grip on his wallet, remembering his own grandmother's. Stories of wartime hunger. She raised me, Marco finally managed to whisper, looking up at Giuseppe through his tears. After my parents died, she's all I have. And now she's dying too, and I don't know how to save her. I just wanted to give her something to eat. I just wanted her to get better. Giuseppe studied the boy's face, the genuine remorse, the pure love shining through the tears, the complete absence of malice or greed. Slowly, deliberately, he released Marco's wrist. "Excuse me," a quiet voice spoke from the edge of the crowd, carrying an authority that made everyone turn. "What seems to be happening here?" An elderly man stepped forward, moving through the gathered onlookers with calm dignity. He was dressed. Simply, a plain grey sweater, dark trousers, worn but clean shoes that suggested someone comfortable with walking long distances. His hair was white as fresh snow, his face deeply lined with age, but his eyes held a clarity that seemed to see everything at once. There was something about his presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Giuseppe straightened slightly, recognizing the tone of someone accustomed to being heard. "This boy was trying to steal bread, sir. But—" He glanced down, and Marco, who was still wiping tears from his cheeks, "The situation appears to be more complicated than simple theft." The elderly man's gaze settled on Marco with gentle interest. "Is that so?" He moved closer, lowering himself slightly to meet the boy at eye level. Despite his age, the movement was graceful, practiced. "And what is your name, young man?" "Marco," the boy whispered, his voice still thick with tears. Something about this stranger's manner made him feel less exposed, though he couldn't understand why. "Marco," the man repeated, as if tasting the name. "A strong name, the patron saint of Venice. You know," he smiled warmly, "and you were trying to take bread because—" "His grandmother is sick," Giuseppe interjected, his tone now protective rather than accusatory. "He says they have no food, and she's been ill for days." The elderly man's expression grew thoughtful. "I see. And where do you live, Marco? Is it far from here?" Marco pointed vaguely toward the poorer quarter of the city. 6 blocks that way, in the apartment building with the broken fountain." "Ah, I know the area." The man's voice carried no judgment, only understanding. "You walked all this way hoping to find food for your grandmother?" The crowd had grown quieter, sensing something significant in the stranger's questions. There was an odd formality to his speech, a careful precision that suggested education and authority, yet his manner remained approachable and kind. "I didn't want to steal," Marco said desperately, looking between Giuseppe and the mysterious man. "I've never taken anything before, but she's so weak, and our last bread was moldy, and I didn't know what else to do." The elderly man nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "Sometimes," he said softly, "love makes us consider desperate measures." The elderly man gently guided Marco away from the curious crowd to a quieter corner near an old stone fountain. Giuseppe, following with genuine concern, etched on his flour-dusted face. The stranger settled onto the fountain's edge with a soft sigh, patting the stone beside him in invitation. "Sit with me for a moment, Marco," he said. "I'd like to tell you something." Marco perched hesitantly on the cool stone, still sniffling but drawn by the man's calm presence. Up close, he could see the deep kindness in those weathered eyes, the way they seemed to hold decades of both sorrow and joy. "When I was about your age," the man began, his voice taking on a distant quality, "I lived with my grandmother too. My parents had died when I was very small, and she was all I had in the world." He smiled softly at the memory. "She was a remarkable woman, strong, faithful, full of stories about saints and miracles, but we were very poor." Marco's eyes widened with recognition, sensing a kindred spirit in this stranger's words. One winter she became terribly ill, the man continued, his hands folded peacefully in his lap. We had no money for medicine, barely any food. I remember standing outside the local bakery, just like you did today, watching people buy warm and bread while my stomach ached with hunger. His voice grew softer. I was so desperate, I considered taking just one small roll. Did you? Marco whispered. The elderly man shook his head. No, but not because I was braver than you. I was simply too frightened. He chuckled gently. But as I stood there, a baker, much like our friend Giuseppe here, noticed me. He asked why I looked so sad, and when I told him about my grandmother, do you know what he did? Marco shook his head, hanging on every word. He filled a basket with bread and soup, and he walked with me all the way to our little room. He brought medicine, too, and blankets. My grandmother recovered, Marco. She lived many more years, long enough to see me grow into a man who could care for her properly. Giuseppe cleared his throat, visibly moved by the story. That baker sounds like a good man. He was, the stranger agreed, his eyes twinkling as he looked at Giuseppe meaningfully. He taught me that sometimes, when we're faced with another person's desperate need, we have the chance to be instruments of grace. Marco felt something shift in his chest, a warmth spreading where shame and fear had been moments before. The elderly man stood with quiet purpose, extending his hand to Marco. Come, let's get your grandmother some proper food. They returned to Giuseppe's stall, where the baker waited with an expression of growing understanding. The stranger surveyed the display thoughtfully, then pointed to several items. I'll take 2 of your finest loaves, some of those sweet rolls, and do you have any soup? I have minestrone from this morning, Giuseppe offered, already reaching for a container. Still warm. Perfect. The man pulled out a worn leather wallet, but as he opened it, his attention was caught by the small crowd that had remained to watch. Excuse me, he called gently to a woman holding a market basket. You heard this boy's story. His grandmother is very ill and needs medicine. Might there be a pharmacy nearby? The woman nodded slowly. Farmacia Benedetti, just 2 streets over. But medicine is expensive. Of course it is. The man's smile was warm but knowing. He turned to a well-dressed gentleman who had been listening. Sir, you look like someone who understands the value of helping one's neighbors. Would you consider contributing to this boy's grandmother's care? Something in his manner, the gentle authority, the assumption of goodness in others, moved people to action. The businessman reached for his wallet without hesitation. Certainly. How much does medicine typically cost? Giuseppe watched in amazement as the elderly stranger orchestrated an impromptu collection. A young mother contributed coins from her purse. An elderly couple offered to send their daughter, a nurse, to check on Marco's grandmother. The woman with the market basket insisted on adding fresh vegetables to the growing pile of supplies. This is remarkable, Giuseppe murmured to Marco, who stood transfixed by the generosity flowing around him. I don't understand, Marco whispered. Why are they all helping? They don't even know me. The mysterious man overheard and knelt beside the boy. Because, Marco, when one person shows compassion, it reminds others of their own capacity for goodness. Your desperation, your love for your grandmother, it touched something real in these people's hearts. Within minutes, Marco found himself holding not just bread and soup, but a collection of money for medicine, promises of ongoing help, and the contact information of 3 families willing to provide regular meals. The transformation was so complete, so overwhelming, that tears returned to his eyes, but these were different tears entirely. Who are you? Marco asked the elderly man, his voice filled with wonder. The stranger's eyes twinkled mysteriously. Just someone who remembers being hungry. The elderly man was preparing to leave, having helped Marco organize all the donations into manageable bundles, when a woman's voice cut through the marketplace chatter with startling clarity. Madonna mia, that's Pope Leo XIV. The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People turned to stare, their eyes moving between the woman who had spoken and the simply dressed elderly man who had orchestrated this moment of community generosity. The silence stretched taut as recognition dawned on face after face. Marco looked up at his mysterious helper, confusion clouding his features. "Pope?" he whispered, not understanding. "Giuseppe's." Face had gone completely white, his flour-dusted hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his counter. "Your Holiness," he breathed, and then louder, his voice cracking with emotion. "Your Holiness, we didn't." The man, Pope Leo XIV, raised a gentle hand, his expression both amused and slightly resigned. "Please, there's no need for formality. I was simply helping a boy in need." But the crowd was already beginning to react. Some fell to their knees on the cobblestones. Others crossed themselves repeatedly, tears streaming down their faces. The businessman who had contributed money stood with his mouth agape, realizing he had just been personally asked for charity by the Pope himself. Marco's young mind struggled to process what was happening. He'd heard of the Pope, of course. Nonna had told him stories, shown him pictures in her old prayer book. But this kind man in simple clothes, who had shared stories of his own hungry childhood, this was the leader of the entire Catholic Church? You're really the Pope?" Marco asked, his voice barely a whisper. Pope Leo smiled warmly, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "I am. But today I was simply a man who remembered being hungry, just as I told you." His eyes sparkled with kindness. "Your love for your grandmother moved me deeply, Marco. It reminded me why we must always care for one another." The crowd pressed closer, but respectfully, as if witnessing something sacred. Giuseppe looked like he might faint, while the woman, who had recognized the Pope, wiped tears from her eyes with the corner of her apron. Marco stared up at this man who had saved not just his grandmother, but somehow his entire world, and felt his legs grow weak with overwhelming gratitude and awe. "I almost stole bread from a bakery," Marco whispered, "and the Pope came to help me." 3 weeks later, Nonna sat at their small wooden table, color returned to her cheeks and strength to her hands as she helped Marco arrange fresh bread rolls in a basket. The medicine purchased with the marketplace donations had broken her fever within days, and the steady supply of food from their new community of supporters had restored her health completely. "Tell me again about the Pope," she said, her eyes sparkling with the same wonder that had filled them every time Marco recounted his story. "He was just like you always said saints would be, Nonna," Marco replied, carefully wrapping the warm rolls in clean cloth. "Kind and gentle, but also ordinary. Like he understood exactly how I felt." They were preparing for Marco's daily visit to Giuseppe's bakery, not as a desperate boy contemplating theft, but as a helper. The baker had offered Marco small jobs in exchange for bread and a few coins, teaching him to arrange displays and sweep flour from the counters. More importantly, Giuseppe had become a friend, someone who understood that acts of kindness could transform entire lives. When Marco arrived at the marketplace that morning, he found Giuseppe arranging a special display near his stall, a small sign that read, "Free bread for those in need," funded by ongoing donations from customers who had witnessed Pope Leo's intervention that day. "The woman who recognized His Holiness comes by every week," Giuseppe explained, nodding toward an elderly lady selecting vegetables nearby. "She brings her entire prayer group now. They call this corner Blessed Ground." Marco smiled, remembering how terrified he'd been in this exact spot just weeks ago. The cobblestones that had felt cold and unforgiving beneath his bare feet now seemed warm with possibility. The very fountain where Pope Leo had shared his childhood story had become a gathering place where neighbors stopped to check on one another, where the businessman who had contributed money now regularly bought extra groceries for struggling families. As he helped Giuseppe serve customers throughout the morning, Marco noticed how many people approached the stall differently now. Word had spread through the neighborhood about the Pope's visit, but more importantly, about the lesson he'd taught, that compassion could multiply infinitely when people chose to care for one another. The young mother who had donated coins from her purse now brought her children to help distribute free bread. The elderly couple who had offered their nurse daughter's services had organized a weekly health clinic in the nearby parish hall. Even the woman who had initially whispered judgmentally about catching them young now volunteered to teach reading to children in the poorer quarters. "It's remarkable," Giuseppe mused, as they watched the steady stream of both customers and volunteers. Before that day, people walked past each other like strangers. Now look, Mrs. Benedetti is teaching young Paolo to read, the banker's wife is organizing a soup kitchen, and old Signor Romano has been fixing broken windows for free all week. Marco nodded, understanding something profound about the ripple effects of grace. The Pope's simple act of kindness hadn't just saved Nonna, it had awakened an entire community's capacity for love. During a quiet moment, Marco walked to the fountain where everything had changed. He could still picture Pope Leo sitting there, sharing his story with such gentle wisdom. The memory filled him with warmth, but also with a deep sense of responsibility. He had been shown extraordinary mercy, and now he understood that mercy was meant to flow through him to others. "Marco," Giuseppe called, approaching with a small envelope. "This came for you today." Inside was a handwritten note on simple paper. "Dear Marco, I hope your grandmother is well. Remember that the love you showed her that day was the real miracle. Keep sharing that love with others. A friend who remembers being hungry." Marco's eyes filled with tears as he held the Pope's words. Below the message was a small drawing of hands breaking bread, and at the bottom, barely visible, a tiny papal seal. "What does it say?" Giuseppe asked gently. Marco read the note aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. When he finished, he looked up at Giuseppe with determination shining in his young eyes. "I learned that when you're desperate, enough to consider stealing bread, sometimes God sends you exactly what you need instead," Marco said thoughtfully. "But maybe the real miracle isn't getting help, it's learning how to help others." Giuseppe smiled, ruffling Marco's hair with a flour-dusted hand. "I think His Holiness would be very proud to hear you say that." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marketplace, Marco folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket next to his heart. He had learned that miracles weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they were as simple as one person choosing to see another's humanity and respond with love.